Invite you, if you will, to join me in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 18. Matthew, chapter 18. Have you heard these words, or maybe spoken these words, or heard or spoken similar words to this? And that is, I can't wait to get out of my parents' house. I can't wait to get out of school where somebody's telling me what to do and what I have to do and when I have to wake up and when I have to eat and when I have to go to sleep. I can't wait to be out on my own where nobody can tell me what to do. We would phrase that as kind of famous last words because we realize that that's not really the way it is it? Didn't quite turn out the way we thought it was going to. But we have a similar scenario in Matthew chapter 18 where his apostles come to Jesus with a question. And Jesus is going to answer that question. In fact, he's going to take a whole lengthy chapter, Matthew chapter 18, to answer that question. But it wasn't at all the answer they thought they were going to get. And so let's, for our study this morning, just camp out here in Matthew chapter 18 and look at this question, and more importantly, Jesus' answer to that question. It says in Matthew 18, verse 1, at that time the disciples came to Jesus saying, who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? It doesn't take much imagination to guess what they were asking there and what they were hoping to be the answer. You can imagine these 12, if it was all 12 of them, coming to Jesus, and they'd ask this question in various ways and in various settings to Jesus. Who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom? Now, it's a possibility, in fact, a high probability, that they had in mind an earthly kingdom. You're going to be the king sitting on a throne, and we want to be, kind of like Joseph was in Pharaoh's kingdom. We want to be the second in command. Maybe we want to be the ruler over the army, the military might. Or even if they were thinking of a spiritual kingdom, they still had a carnal bent on that kingdom. I want a position of a power. I want to be able to tell somebody what to do. I want to be the boss. I want to be the greatest in this kingdom. And who is that going to be? Now, it might very well be that they did not expect Jesus to give any kind of description of character. They may have wanted him to name a name. Is it going to be Peter, Andrew, or James, or John? Who's it going to be? Now, it is possible that they weren't necessarily asking for a specific apostle who was going to be greatest, but what are the attributes that are going to be the greatest in the kingdom? However, they thought this question was going to be answered, I can assure you it was not the way Jesus answered it. Because Jesus is going to answer, in fact, it's going to seem for several verses that Jesus just ignored their question and is talking about something completely different. Because they said, who's going to be the greatest, the loftiest, the mightiest, who will cause people to bow down before them? And Jesus' answer is simply going to be, you need to be a servant. You need to think about others rather than yourself. And I think what Jesus is saying, he's either answering that question one of two ways, which are really the same. He's saying this is the one who's elevated in the kingdom. Or maybe he's saying, you've got it all wrong. Don't even think about greatest and being elevated. So let's look at Jesus' answer here in Matthew chapter 18. Surprisingly, who is the greatest in the kingdom? And maybe they expected him to point to someone maybe like Alexander the Great, the historical figure, be like him. Or be like some other great conqueror or military leader or person in position of authority. And yet, what does Jesus do? Jesus calls a little child to him, set him in the midst of them, and said, assuredly, I say to you, unless you're converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. What a powerful object lesson. Here, these 13 men, we assume, are sitting here, and Jesus brings this little child. Have you ever tried to really picture that scene? I don't know how little the little child was, Can you imagine this little kid being brought in, and how maybe sheepish and embarrassed he felt sitting there between these 13 grown men, Jesus and his 12 apostles, and just like, uh, you know, looking at. And that would have been the perfect object lesson, not just a child, but maybe a child who's kind of bashful or cowering a little bit in fear. And Jesus said, greatest? You want to talk about being greatest in the kingdom? I want you to be like this little child. This little child who, in that culture, had no societal standing at all. We have to think about children, and much of this object lesson would apply to the way we view children today. But certainly in that ancient culture, children had basically no rights, no societal standing. Now, I'm going to sound like an old man here, but kids have got it a lot nicer than they did when I was a kid. And I was thinking about this lesson and having this kind of societal standing, even family standing. Now, we never moved as a kid. We moved into the house when I was 3 years old, and mom and dad never moved out of that house until they moved in with us before their passing. But if we had moved, you know how much a vote me and my brothers had got about whether we're going to move and where we're going to move and when we're going to move. In fact, we'd have probably found out we were moving when the moving van pulled into the yard. You know, parents didn't care. You're a kid. You'll do what I say. And so that's the idea here. You want this great position of authority. I want you to become like a little child who has no power, who has no authority, who's just humble and meek and maybe bashful. And so he takes this object lesson and now says that you must become like little children. Therefore, look at verse 4. Here's our first point in how Jesus answers the question, who's the greatest in the kingdom? He says, therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. You humble yourself like this little child. You recognize that you don't have any position, that you don't have any power, any authority. You humble yourself and come into my kingdom. Now, it's important for us to note the transition here. It's rather subtle, but it's important for us to note that Jesus is saying, he's got this little child in front of him and says, become like this little child. You become the child. And so from now on, when he's talking about little children, he's not talking about this little kid anymore. He's talking about us, Jesus' followers, who have become as little children. Let's notice that transition as we read on. Whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me. Verse 6, he goes on to say, but whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin. So let's just pause there. He's not talking about that little kid anymore, is he? He's talking about those who have come into his kingdom, who have become like little children. They're the little children that he's talking about. And I think we can prove that two ways. Number one, he says, cause one of these little ones who believe in me. We understand that a child doesn't have the capacity to truly have faith in God and in Jesus Christ. And he goes on to say, one of these little ones, if you cause him to sin. Well, we understand that a little child might do something wrong. He may disobey his parents, may make a mistake, may get in trouble, but they're not sinning in the sense of violating God. And so when he talks about you cause one of these little ones, he's pointing not to that little kid who's he's using just as an object lesson. He's pointing to his followers. If you cause one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if he hung a millstone around his neck and were drowned in the depth of the sea. Now, no, we don't get to pick how we die, but that has to be one of the worst ways, wouldn't it? Drowning. And having a millstone, you know what a millstone is? It's the stone that they use to grind the grain. And I know there's different sizes of those, but probably the millstone he has in mind here, one grown, strong man couldn't pick that thing up. And you tie that around your neck and you get thrown. The point here is that there's going to be no hope of rescue. You are going to drown. And you'd be better off facing that then you would be facing me. If you cause one, again, not little child, but one of my followers, if you cause him to sin, you'd be better off to be drowned in the depths of the sea. Who's the greatest, Jesus? Well, I want you to humble yourself and become as a little child, and I want you to avoid offending anyone. Now, I think it's important, probably in our culture, to define the word offending here. You know, people get so offended so easily today. That's not really the concept here that he's talking about. He's talking about causing them to sin is the offense. You cause that person to sin. You cause them to stumble through whatever way it might be. Whether you entice them and tempt them to sin, hey, we're going to go do this, come do this with us. Or whether it's just because of your action and your attitude toward them that maybe you drive them away from church because you're arrogant and you're hateful or whatever. In whatever capacity, if you cause one of my followers to sin, Jesus said, you don't want to face me on that day of judgment. And so notice as we transition through Jesus, again, lengthy answer here. Is Jesus ignoring the question? Or is he just turning the question on its head? Who's the greatest? Well, I want you to become like a child. And I want your concern to be not who's going to come and kiss your ring and bow down to you and ask you what we can do for you, but I want your concern to be what you can do for others and how you can humble yourself and how that you can make sure that you don't do anything to cause someone else to sin. He goes on famously now and says, woe to the world, verse 7, woe to the world because of offenses, for offenses must come. But woe to the man by whom the offense comes. In other words, people are going to stumble over various ways, but don't let you be that stumbling block. Verse 8, if your hand or foot causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. It's better for you to enter into life lame or maimed rather than having 2 hands or 2 feet to be cast into the everlasting fire. And if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. It is better for you to enter into life with 1 eye rather than having 2 eyes cast into hellfire. You know, I used to think that Jesus was making a transition here between offending others, causing others to sin, and now causing ourselves to sin. And that still may be it. But I think maybe if we put it in its context, that he's saying, look, you don't need to sin. You don't need to cause somebody else to sin. And so he uses these extreme, hyperbolic illustrations. Put a millstone around your neck and be cast into the sea. You'd be better off to cut off your hand or your foot or pluck out your eye. Do whatever is possible that you don't sin by causing someone else to sin. That's how serious this is. You're worried about who's going to be vice president in the kingdom, who's going to sit on my right hand and on my left hand, when you ought to be worried about how serious it is that you cause somebody else to stumble. Don't do it. Cut your hand or your foot off. Pluck out your eye. Because if you do it, it'd be better off to hang a millstone around your neck and be drowned in the depth of the sea. That's how serious this subject is. And so we began to see that Jesus is completely flipping the script on these disciples. It's not about who's the mightiest, who's going to be looked up to. It's all about how you treat one another. Now he says in verse 10, take heed that you do not despise one of these little ones. Again, he's not talking about this minor child who's sitting in their midst. The little ones are now his followers, his believers. You do not despise one of these little ones, for I say to you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. For the Son of Man who's come to seek and to save that which was lost. Don't despise one another. Now, the word despise in the English language maybe takes a little bit different connotation than the word that he's using here. This doesn't mean the idea of just like, I hate that person. I can't stand the sight of. That's what we kind of think of when we think of despise. And it can involve that, but it's also the idea of just mistreating, of not properly elevating that person, of not giving them the esteem and the honor and the concern by offending them or causing them to sin that you ought to. And so he says, don't do that. Don't cause them to sin. Don't mistreat them, maybe is another way that we could say that. Because he says they have the attention of heaven. Now, and that's the way I'm going to have to phrase that, because I'm honest with you, I don't know what that means when he says their angels always see the face of my Father in heaven. Is he talking about guardian angels? Is he talking about something? I don't know. But I do know this, that he's teaching, because he mentions the Father and the Son and angels in that. And with no disrespect to Garth Brooks, but what he's saying is they've got friends in high places. Heaven notices them. Heaven's eyes are on them, and if you mistreat them, look who you've angered. Look who you've made mad. And so don't mistreat them. Don't despise them. Don't look down on them. And is Jesus saying the fact that you, in fact, maybe he is saying this, the fact that you would even ask that question shows that you're despising them. If I'm the greatest, what does that make you? You ain't the greatest. You're the leastest. And he's saying that's not the way you should be looking at one another. Do not despise one of these little ones. What do you think? If a man has 100 sheep and one of them goes astray, does he not leave the 99 and go to the mountains and seek the one who is straying? And if he should find it, assuredly I say to you, he rejoices more over that sheep than the 99 who did not go astray. Even so, it's not the will of your Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones, that's his followers, his believers, should perish. You see how God cares about each individual one? You know, when we read that story, the idea of a shepherd, I don't know that we really think about it. We think about the care for the one, but he says he's the shepherd whose job it was to protect the entire flock. And I'm assuming there's only one shepherd for each flock. He leaves the 99 unprotected to go and find the one sheep. I'm going to tell you, that doesn't make any sense. Leaving 99 to go find one. That makes absolutely no sense unless you're the one who's lost and needs that shepherd to come and find him. And he says that's the way God feels about his followers, his little ones, his sheep. And so I think there's two lessons here. He's saying that's the way you need to feel as well, but you need to also consider if God cares that much about that one, again, what do you think he's going to do to you if you mistreat that one? What would that shepherd do to a wolf who was attacking or ready to attack that one sheep? We might put it this way, it would be better if that wolf had a millstone hung around his neck and was cast into the depths of the sea. But, verse 6, whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me, again, not children, but his followers, whoever causes one of them to sin, I'm backing up there. Verse 15, moreover, if your brother sins, so not only, he's taking it a step further, not only are you not to be the one who induces that person to sin, but what do you do if he does sin? If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he hears you, you've gained your brother. But if he will not hear, take with you one or two more, that at the mouth of two or three witnesses every word may be established. And if he refuses to hear them, you tell it to the church or to the entire assembly. But if he refuses even to hear the church, let him be to you as a heathen and as a tax collector. you don't cause one of them to sin. But even if they do sin, you go to the extreme lengths of basically, again, doing whatever you can to bring that person back, to restore that relationship that is there. Now, I think it's important. In fact, I know it's important for us to consider the motive here. It seems that in this scenario, what's happened here is that one brother has sinned against another brother. And Jesus is saying, if you're the offended party here, here's what you need to do. And we could talk about the mechanics, the steps of what he says, and that would be a worthwhile study. But I want us to talk about the big picture here. What he's saying is, you do whatever you can to reconcile. And I think that's very important that he's not saying you do this so that you can get that fella told. He did you wrong. You go sick him. That's not the point of this. That's not why you're going to him. That's not why you're bringing others. That's not why you're involving the whole church. Everybody needs to know the bad things you did to me. And so let's just expose it and let's get you out in the light to show you for the scoundrel you really are. That's not what's happening here at all. He says, you've gained your brother. That's the mentality. That's why you go to him. That's why you bring others. That's why you might involve the whole church, is because we're wanting this relationship restored. And that motive, the motivation, and the attitude and the heart behind that means everything. It means everything to God, and it'll mean everything to that brother. He's not going to come back if you approach him. It's kind of like I've talked about parents and children. You remember your mom or your dad standing there with his belt in the hand saying, come here to me. I think I want to come. Don't run from me when I got this switch in my hand. Well, that kind of seems like the thing I ought to be doing. We don't involve church discipline that way. They come back so we can get you told, so we can put you in front of the group and just embarrass you and shame you for the thing. Now, that doesn't mean that we gloss over sin and that we excuse sin at whatever level and against whoever is the offended party. It does mean that that's not the point. The point is we want to win that soul. We want to restore that person to our good graces and, most importantly, to the good graces of God. And then lastly, he's going to conclude this answer. Remember, don't forget the question. Who's going to be who's the greatest in the kingdom of God? And Jesus doesn't talk about positions of authority, of power, of climbing the corporate ladder. He just says, humble yourself and care about one another. That's the question you ought to be asking. And he concludes it now with the whole concept again of reconciliation and of what we might simply entitle outlandish forgiveness. Verse 21, Peter came to him and said, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Now let's pause there. Historians tell us that the Talmud, the ancient Hebrew scholars, had put a limit on it. And they must have been baseball fans because the Talmud, the rabbinic limit was three. 3 strikes, you're out. They said that's how often you have to forgive somebody. If they do it the 4th time, too bad. And if you think about it, that's kind of fair in our way of thinking, isn't it? Once, twice, but 3, that's being even gracious, we might say. But Peter, I think, is more generous than that. He more than doubles it. He says, how often should I forgive my brother? Up to 7 times? Now, Jesus is going to answer this question on at least 2 occasions. In Luke chapter 17, he ups it. Maybe Peter thought 3, 7. Aren't I gracious, Lord? 7 times. Both times that Jesus speaks on this subject, he takes it far much further than that, to an outlandish standard. Peter says 7 times. Remember Luke chapter 17? Jesus said 7 times, but that's not all he said. He said 7 times in a day. You mean I got to forgive you 7 times in the same day? And here he ups the ante by saying not 7 times, 70 times 7. And don't do the math in your head. That's not the point. And I'm sure they're thinking what we're thinking. That's asking a lot. 7 times in one day. 70 times 7. You can come to me and wrong me that many times, and I got to forgive you. Truly, not just saying I forgive you, but truly meaning that. That's asking a lot. In fact, when we say that's asking too much, God. And if that's our thought, if that's our mentality, then this story applies to us that he tells. Look in Matthew chapter 18, verse 23. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven's like a certain king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. And he began to settle accounts. One was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. Let's pause there again. Always a difficulty translating, converting money from ancient times and an ancient culture and financial system to now. But the best way of looking at that, that's probably about 20 years' income. So you do the math. Well, how much you make in a year times 20? So one was brought to him who owed that amount, but he was not able to pay. His master commanded that he be sold with his wife and his children and all that he had. That was the custom in that day, and that payment be made. The servant therefore fell down before him and saying, Master, have patience on me, and I'll pay you all. No, you won't. You want the gracious and the merciless, but you can't pay that debt. Then the master of that servant was moved with compassion and released him and forgave the debt. But that servant went out and found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. That's probably like 100 days of income. And he laid hands on him and took him by the throat, saying, Pay me what you owe me. So his fellow servant fell down at his feet and begged him, saying, Have patience with me, I'll pay you all. And he would not, but went and threw him into prison till he should pay the debt. And so when his fellow servants saw what he had done, they were moved, they were grieved, and came and told their master all that had been done. Then his master, after he had called him, said to him, You wicked servant, I forgave all that debt because you begged me. Should you not have also shown compassion on your fellow servant, just as I had pity on you? And his master was angry and delivered him to the torturers until he should pay all that was due him. So my heavenly Father also will do to you if each of you from his heart does not forgive his brother his trespasses. 7 times in a day, that's asking too much, God. 490 times, you're asking too much, Father. Until I remember how much he's forgiven me. And maybe the whole point of converting that money into modern day money misses the point, but the point is that that's a drop in the bucket compared to how many times he's forgiven me. So who's the greatest? Either Jesus is saying, that's the attitude of who's going to excel in my kingdom. Or maybe Jesus is just saying, that's a stupid question. You missed the point. It's not about being greatest. It's about humbling yourself and serving one another. You want to be a citizen of this kingdom, that's the attitude we ought to have. And so, as we sang before the lesson, love one another. That's what Jesus is saying. That's what this kingdom is all about, is loving and serving and not doing anything that would cause your brother or sister to stumble. It's a tough answer, not the answer they wanted to that question. And it's tough in its application. But God demands that of us, that we be as holy as He is holy, and that we be as loving and forgiving as He is loving and forgiving. Well, actually, He doesn't demand that of us. He's forgiven us so much more than He's asking us to forgive and to love one another. If we can help you to become a citizen in that kingdom, not looking for places of lofty grandeur and position and authority, but to be a citizen of that kingdom so that you can get on your knees and wash one another's feet and to serve and to love and to forgive. If we can help you in that pursuit this morning, let it be known as together we stand and as we sing.